everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in gaming, how games work, why they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg. I'm with my co-host Mark, as always.
Hello, everyone.
And today is a rather special episode, in that this is take number 2 of this entire podcast. Unfortunately, due to some tech errors, my entire side of the first one got recorded, and Mark's disappeared. So unless you want to listen to one side of an entire podcast...
It's really fascinating. It's pretty interesting, actually.
Is it? Did you listen to it a bit?
I listened to a little bit of it. You make some really good points. It's like you're talking with somebody, but you're not.
Yeah. It would be probably kind of surreal for me to listen to, hearing me talk to no one. So as opposed to trying to have Mark fill in all of the spaces with his audio, we're just going to do it again, and it should be fine. So
yeah, actually, this might be like incredibly polished because we've already done this before. So.
Yeah, because we've gone through it, so... We'll try to maintain some level of the spontaneity that happens when we record normally, but also, we've already done all this, so hopefully some of our thoughts come out a little bit quicker, and in a more convincing fashion. So today's topic is going to be tutorials in large part. Mark's finding the game, which I really like, which is kind of this idea of, we were playing, last month we were doing a bunch of horror stuff, and in fact the last week of that we did a bunch of horror indie games. And a lot of them were, not very polished because they were indies / some of them I think were even grad school projects, kind of more proof of concept stuff. And as we were playing them, we realized that we got stuck, like not like stuck in the game as the game would want you to be stuck, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But rather we couldn't actually figure out how to play the game, not like in a control based way, but like we didn't know what to do next in that kind of classic stuck fashion. And we realized that was a very despite some of the criticisms we level at AAA games on the ordinary, that's something that a lot of AAA games actually avoid in a pretty good fashion, which is making sure that you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, at least in the short term. And we realized that was a really important thing, and the idea of how a game teaches you itself, because that's the point of games, right? They're all within genres, but they're also different, and that's the reason that one of the reasons we love them. And so they need to really be giving you a sense of how to go about playing the game in the quote unquote correct fashion. And the two ways to do that or the two facets of that are tutorials, which is kind of the probably most obvious one, which is the game at the very beginning trying to teach you in all of the different ways that happens, but also throughout the game later, avoiding that state that Mark and I got in Shudder, which was that kind of like lost state, right? Where we were we had complete control over the situation and our character, but we didn't know what to do, and we didn't know what the game wanted us to do, and it was unintentional at that point. Right. So this episode is going to be talking about both of those things in tandem. We're going to start with tutorials and what games have done them well, which ones have done them poorly. Let's see here. Where you want to start with talking about The Witness, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So in the beginning, before I played The Witness, I actually saw a trailer. I know, right? This is an epic beginning.
Did you just invoke scripture there?
Before I played The Witness,
in the beginning, there's a bunch of biblical references in that game. So
yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it's very appropriate. But I watched a trailer because I wanted to see if I was going to buy this game, which is a good thing to do. You should always check out trailers.
We encourage that here on Gaming Mechanics.
But so I watched the trailer and I saw kind of what it was about, and it seemed interesting and really cool aesthetic. So I went ahead and purchased it. And when you start up The Witness, it's a very, very minimal UI. Like, you start up the game, there's not even a menu saying like new game or start or anything. There's just literally a button, and then you're in a tunnel. Load right in. Yeah, you're in a tunnel and you're walking around and you're playing the game immediately. And there's no like heads-up display for The Witness. It's just your vision. And so the first thing you do is you walk forward, you walk up to a console, and you start doing a puzzle. But you know to do that because you saw them do that in the trailer. In fact, the trailer is mostly people walking up to consoles and doing puzzles. So you already, I mean, because the game is so straightforward, like the number of things that you're doing is not that varied. You're doing different puzzles. Now the puzzles change, and it keeps things interesting, but you're mostly going up to these consoles and solving puzzles, and then sort of solving like a meta puzzle related to the console that's in front of you. So like you might solve a puzzle and
make
then
something else happen in the world, and you have to make different things happen in the world in different orders in order to solve a big puzzle, right?
Right. So the island is sort of its own giant puzzle all by itself. But you solve that giant puzzle by solving these little mini puzzles. and you already know to do that from watching the trailer. So it basically doesn't need a tutorial. In fact, I don't think there was any tutorial in the game. The game does sort of slowly introduce ideas in the puzzle to you. So they'll introduce like different mechanics and different types of dots or lines on the puzzle that mean different things, and you actually don't know what they mean right away. But that's part of the game, is trying to figure out what those mean. So it doesn't feel frustrating to a player like, I'm supposed to kill this enemy, but I don't know how. It's actually, oh, the game is learning how to do this.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one thing that we kind of came up with in the first time we were doing this podcast, was like finding like the game, like capital T, capital G, right? Like what's the game about? If you distill it all the way down to the bottom of like what you're actually doing in the game, then what is the game? And in the Witness's case, it is to figure out like this world that you're in. It's a puzzle game.
Right.
Puzzle games in general, the game is it's more acceptable to get into that kind of lost state that we're going to talk about a little bit more in a puzzle game, right? Because the point of it is to be uncertain at sometimes, and you need some semblance of fail state in the puzzle game where you are trying to figure out, trying to do something, right? You're trying to overcome some obstacle.
Right.
So that makes sense.
Like if you opened the Witness with like explaining everything that every item that you could encounter in a puzzle and what it meant, the game would be much shorter and a bit easier. And I would submit it's just kind of a different game at that point.
And way less engaging, right? I mean, part of the beauty of that game is part of that mystery being in your characters, actually inhabiting the same space as the character is, which is, as a player, I don't really know what's going on, and we have these councils, and this is the best thing I can do, it seems. I'm going to try to figure out what's happening.
Right.
Similar to Myst or some of the classic adventure games.
Yeah, very similar to Myst.
Where that are kind of open-ended with puzzles. That feeling is like entirely genre appropriate, right? As opposed to, say, like if you're playing like Call of Duty, right, and you ended up in a portion with no guns and no like enemies, and you're walking around and you're trying to figure out like what to do. Like that's not appropriate for that. Or Halo, right?
As a designer, like you don't really want to keep your player in that area for very long, unless you have a really specific reason why you're disarming the player at that point.
And even in puzzle games, like you said, we don't want to stay there too long, because then it really does just become boring, right?
Right.
It loses a whole lot of. So the one thing I wanted, the cool thing about that the Witness does so well, that you mentioned, is basically that it was so self-explanatory that literally even just watching the trailer was enough of a tutorial for you to start playing the game. And you could have even not watched the trailer and probably played the game. So that's like one of our kind of another one of our main topics for this one, is that in our kind of mini thesis is that games are in general, and we talk about this a lot, but especially for tutorials, I think they're at their best when learning the game comes kind of completely intuitively. Not through a bunch of choppy tutorials, or not in some really kind of contrived way, but when the game's ability to teach itself is integrated into the game and it feels natural. And there's a bunch of ways to do that. And The Witness is a fantastically elegant example of that, in that you literally load up the game and are immediately playing. And part of the game is teaching you the game, right? Portal is another great example of this, the original Portal. That Portal, the game, so it's very short. And that's another thing to mention, that we did notice that really the easiest way to do some of these things, like have that really organic, elegant integration of learning mechanics, probably comes best from simple games, right? Simple and shorter games, because there's just less to teach, and so it's easier to kind of put in. So Portal is a very short game, the first one, and in large part is actually just one big tutorial. Actually, each new room kind of introduces a new thing to do, and then you put it all together to beat GLaDOS at the end. Spoiler for people who haven't played the original Portal, or if you're listening to this podcast and you somehow don't know that GLaDOS is the bad guy in Portal, I don't know what to tell you. Like I'm sorry. There's no
there's no help for you.
Kind of, yeah. There's no hope. Abandon all hope, ye who enter. But anyway, so Portal is like basically one giant tutorial, and it works in that way, right? Because that's the same thing. The game is teaching you how to play the game. It's teaching you how to literally, that like the tagline, like how to think with portals, which was so brilliant. And it works in that way. But again, I think it's because that's primarily very short, and it's actually is very simple in a lot of ways, right? There's this one key mechanic, which is the portals, and then a bunch of new ways to use it, and that's pretty much it. And so for that reason, it's very very simple to be able to kind of teach and add on new things to, as opposed to, okay, you have the portal gun, now you have like another gun that stops time, and how are all these interactions going to start? And then you can find another thing that like gives you a one-time teleport across the map, and like so on and so forth without a portal.
Right.
None of those things happen.
Right, and you don't have like mechanically you don't have a ton of options in Portal. Like you can shoot a portal and it can be blue or it can be orange, and those are
Yeah,
your
exactly.
options.
Yeah, it's binary.
Um, and so I think, and this we will talk more about this later, but this I remember in one of our previous episodes we talked about depth versus breadth learning,
Hmm.
and so for systems that aren't that deep, I think they lend themselves really well to this sort of learn as you go tutorial,
Hmm.
because you can introduce things um, slowly into the context of the game, and they don't have to
Right.
be. Um, you're not like gimping the UI like in an RTS. If you want to introduce elements one at a time, you sort of have to change the UI that the user has, because
Yeah.
in an RTS, like all the options are always available to you,
Right.
except for when you're in this weird tutorial mode where they just artificially restrict some things. That's not really the
Right. And
game. They just kind of cut that game down so that you don't have to deal with all the complexity right away.
right. It's too complex. Right. Yeah. RTSs are kind of probably arguably one of the most complex from base. One of the most complex things that you have to learn. Like you have to learn a heck of a lot of things before you can start playing like the game proper, which is like strategizing with all of these different pieces and units and maps and as opposed to Portal or like fighting games or another genre that are actually oddly very very simple in a lot of ways, right? You get in, and that's an example of really deep learning, not very broad, but you have to learn. Oh wait, no, is that opposite?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's deep learning.
Yeah, no. So in like fighter games case, you get in, you can immediately start playing the game, right? There's four buttons in large part, and you can move up and down. It's usually going to be on a 2D scale, and you can start playing the game and understanding it. But if you want to be good at it, you have to start learning. All the combos are there, and you begin practicing. So it's very simple. Like it's very clear what you have to do. The game tells you exactly what you have to do in writing for the combos. It's just then from there, being able to actually do that is hard, and it takes time and practice. So
Right.
it's very different from like we said the RTS, where it's like yeah, it's really easy to understand the idea of like clicking on a unit and then clicking somewhere else to move it. But then but that's not the game. That's like understanding. That's just how to control things. The game is figuring out how to use all these different units and all their different abilities and how they interact. And if there's different factions, then how different factions match up against each other. And then on top of that, how different maps match up, and so on and so forth. And it's just this huge, just kind of ballooning sphere of knowledge that you need to even begin playing the game. Like jump onto the StarCraft 2 ladder right now if you've never played StarCraft 2 and try playing it, and you'll just get murdered and you won't know why. And keep on
Right.
playing and you'll just keep on getting murdered and you still won't know why. Like that game, you so much need to know before you can even start playing it.
Right. Yeah.
As
No.
opposed to, like we said, some of these other ones that have really, really wonderful, simple tutorials like The Witness or Portal, um, where you can immediately just start kind of pressing buttons and you're there.
And Portal is, I think, special just because like it's the whole setup, the whole story is you are a science experiment and
Oh, yeah.
you're being taught like how to do things, and
Yeah.
so like it's kind of a gimme. Like it's literally the story is written as a tutorial, so
Yeah, yeah, that you are playing.
and it is a great example, but not every game can fit the tutorial in that seamlessly. Uh,
Right. Not everyone has that luxury of being
right,
able to, where you are, the game is you playing a tutorial. Like, that's actually it.
right. I think
Like, the
it,
game is you playing as a person playing a tutorial. Like,
yeah, exactly. But an
it's pretty neat.
example of maybe a little bit more, it's smooth integration, but it's not as seamless as Portal would be the Halo tutorial.
Right.
Back when Halo controls were not standard for a lot of shooters,
Mhm.
or a variant thereof. They actually needed to introduce even like how to use the joysticks to look around, because that two joystick looking for first person shooter was relatively new. And
Yeah, it's
so
crazy to think about. But yeah, the idea that one would control motion and like strafing, and the other was going to be the ridicule,
yeah,
was a new idea. That was a new thing.
yeah, and so in the beginning of the wow, I keep using that phrase. At the
That's
start of the
fine.
game, when you're put into your new suit, they have you do a system check of the suit basically, and they bring different parts of the suit online and ask you to try them out. And so they do come up with a story reason for why they're suddenly asking Master Chief to turn his head left and right. So
Right.
there is a way to integrate it into the story, but it's not as like under the radar as in Portal, where it's like it's yeah, it's the entire game.
Yeah, exactly. That one is interesting, and that's another one of my kind of favorite. Well, maybe not favorites, but something I like in games at least is that it's really simple and it's really low bar, like you said. It is at the end of the day. It says like look this, like use the right stick to look left, and then look right. And so on and so forth. And here's how you pick up a gun and now fire at these targets. And so in that way, it is like pretty simple / kind of something that appears to not be the best. But at the same time, there's that little extra layer of a very, very plausible in-game reason that this would be happening that I really liked, right? Like if Master Chief, especially in terms of like when you think about the fantasy of that game, which is you are a unstoppable superhuman space marine warrior, it'd make absolutely no sense to try to sell you that and have the very first interactions that you have with the world be completely weak and confused, right?
Right.
So the idea of putting him in a new suit of armor, or I think in the first game, he's just waking up from stasis,
and
having
doing
to
like a health check.
Yeah, basically to make sure that that the stasis wake up process was like successful. So anyway, so that I appreciate that sort of things in RTSs or not RTSs, just tutorials where you're able at least to have some semblance of reason why you would need to be a little bit gimped for a little bit, and then you learn, and then you're immediately into the fantasy from there, as opposed to like trying to play a really big. One thing that I'm kind of split on the God of War series, which would always have it was known for its big, gigantic opening acts and boss fights. Each game starts with this ridiculous opening fight. And in general, what they had to do for those boss fights, even though they were really cool and big, you weren't good at the game yet. And they're actually very simple. And you didn't have usually all of your powers that you were going to have for the rest of the game. So even though it was this huge, they kind of served as this tutorial and they masqueraded as this huge giant thing. And it feels really good because you get to kill this huge monster and you have this epic fight. You don't actually you're not really doing much and you're not that good at anything yet. And then the game kind of starts after that fight proper when you actually begin learning, then you get shot down to Hades or wherever and you're fighting skeletons.
Right.
So that was always kind of I never quite knew how to feel about that because on one hand it is celebrated for just how amazingly cool those opening sequences are, but they always felt kind of cheap because you don't have to be that good to win.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think God of War is like a shining example of just like its power fantasy to the max. And I think it's like brilliant. Yeah, you literally are killing gods. But it's brilliant for them to do a tutorial, something that typically makes you feel pandered to and patronized and inept, and instead make it feel really epic. And you do run the risk of when you actually step back and look at it, you're like, well, this is dumb. Like, there's no way this was that hard because I'm new to the game. But within the fantasy of the game, I think it's very consistent.
It's pretty well.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you aren't having to at any point, if you don't want to think about the fact that you're not any good at the game, you don't have to. Because you can progress without realizing that and having to improve.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is that they and eventually I think they ran into that. We'll see how the new one is. They're rebooting the series after, when was Ascension? Ascension was 2013 maybe? They're rebooting the whole series for next gen, and we got the Norse mythology setting now instead of the Greek mythology of the original series, which I think is going to be great. But it'll be interesting to see how because they basically kept on ramping that up, right? After the first game, it was huge, and the second game was insane, and the third game, you literally are riding Titans up Mount Olympus to tear it down and kill all of the gods. And they eventually were kind of running out of ways to keep on escalating those first fights. The first fight in 3 is, in fact, you riding up on the back of a Titan and fighting the sea god Poseidon as you scale Mount Olympus and destroy parts of it and eventually kill one of the 3 main Olympian gods in Poseidon. And I just don't know where you go from that. After the fact. And so I think even from what we've seen a little bit, and this is kind of a side note, I love the God of War series. God of War 2 is the first M game I ever bought and played under my mother's nose. And it's a very special place for me, and some of the best, most fluid controls in the world for action games. But that being said, they did begin to peter out there. So I'm interested to see, even from some of the early stuff that they showed at E3 earlier this year with God of War 4, which I think they're just going to call God of War again, maybe.
Classic.
Exactly. They're toning it down a lot from the start, where you're not this god slaying. You literally, spoiler, you kill all of the gods. They're all dead.
There's nothing left. You're having to go fight alien races.
Exactly. So I don't know how. So I think it's smart for them to kind of bring down that tone. That could be another episode we could talk about, which is serial games as you release games, having the problem that you have as trying to continually make a player more powerful.
Yeah,
but also needing it to be a game, you know?
Yeah, and we touched on that a little bit when we were talking about MMOs and how
Yeah,
you,
yeah,
of course, people will always reach the maximum. But anyway,
yeah.
let's keep going with
Let's return to our
tutorials.
tutorial discussion here.
Yeah.
What else we got? Oh
Well,
yeah, I want to mention.
go
Oh, go
ahead.
ahead.
Okay, I was going to talk about Dark Souls
Yep,
and the
that's where I was
lack
going
of
to.
tutorial. So the games we mentioned are good integrations of the tutorial into the game. Dark Souls has no integration, but it's just avoided a tutorial altogether. It is particularly brutal. The closest thing to a tutorial, I guess, where you really get to test your metal. It's not even fair to call it a tutorial. It's more just like hazing. Uh,
Yeah. that's, that's perfect. Yeah.
is the Asylum Demon,
More of
which
a
totally
yeah.
caught me and Greg by surprise. We played probably 20 to 25 hours of Dark Souls over a period of several
Yeah.
days. And
Yeah.
yeah, when Asylum Demon showed up, we were not expecting that. And
We were
at that
quite started.
point, you get to see if you have what it takes to get through this game, because this is how brutal it's going to be. And so it
Exactly.
does a really good job setting the tone for the game. Like you're not going to be helped really. There's not going to be there's not going to be
Nope.
prompts. There's not going to be even a lot of dialogue. Stuff's going to happen, and you're going to have to figure out how to deal with it.
Yep.
And so in that way, it does teach you how to play the game, which is you just got to think hard and try to figure it out.
Right, which is brilliant. Like we were talking about, kind of like that idea of like, okay, what is the game? In Dark Souls, the game, like death in Dark Souls isn't the fail state in Dark Souls
No.
necessarily, right? That is part of the gameplay. That's the idea. So when you get punished by the Asylum Demon immediately and die, that is not. That's actually doing what the game is, right? Like the game in Dark Souls is this incredibly long, um, frustrating, many times difficult, unforgiving, surprising sequence of events. And
Right.
so, in some ways, actually, the game would be doing you a disservice if it had this really simple tutorial where you're like learning how to swing, your sword. And it's the other thing it's a very simple game in some ways too, right? Where you have basically roll controls, you have block, and then you have your attacks, and that's the core gameplay of Dark Souls.
Right.
Um, and you are taught that in that sequence. But it also sets the entire tone for the game, and as well as it melds kind of similarly what I was saying, kind of that melding of form and function that I think I talk about a lot, which I really love in games, which is melding the reality of your character too is you're a revenant, basically a dead person come back to life. You don't remember anything. You don't know anything about where you are or what you're doing. And it is a confusing, scary world, and so you as the player are in that exact same place and actually experience maybe some of the same things your character would, which in an action or a role playing game is, I think, a super super impressive feat and a really important one, or something I at least really value in role playing games when I have a similar experience as what I'm supposed to be having as a character.
Right.
And Dark Souls does that all very, very elegantly and very quickly and brutally. And once you complete it, you actually are ready to go out into the world and start playing the game.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we didn't feel like I mean, there was a few things that we discovered, like parrying and things like that we weren't quite
Sure.
sure that you could do because we hadn't read really anything up about the mechanics of the game. Um,
Right. We talked about like the fact that, so again, Dark Souls is like the game proper um, is that kind of problem solving, the rolling around, the basic combat, the exploration, the figuring out how to somehow overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. One thing that Dark Souls doesn't do too well in terms of its tutorial is that, unfortunately, another part of that is there's there's the whole character building aspect of it
oh yeah.
as a role playing game, or getting new armor or new weapons, or trying to figure out where to put skill points, or how some of the key mechanics work in terms of the resources, like humanity as a resource. Those are actually all very very poorly explained. So that very 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 dumbed, and that's those are more complex systems, right? So it seems to make sense with our current kind of thesis of tutorials seem to work best when there's simple systems. Yeah, the simple system of combat and how to think about the game is well explained by Dark Souls opening act, but its ability it's the complex stuff, which is the character building and the stats and the idea of how to kind of metagame it. That is not explained at all, and we had to go to the internet basically to figure some of those things out. Like when we
Right.
level up, like, okay, what do you spend your stuff on? because part of the game is you couldn't play the whole game. The feedback loop can't be play the entire game and see what works as a character, and then play the whole game again and see if a different build works. Like,
Right.
that's not fun.
Like,
That's
and
not
that's, I would argue that's not even like, that's not the experience they intended you to have. Like,
exactly
is it okay to be wandering around Dark Souls and not sure where to go? Yeah. Is it okay to not know how to kill a particular enemy? Absolutely. But like, when you don't know what a specific like stat change is going to do, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to like change the stat and then like do an experiment to see how it affects combat and then like make a note about that for next time?
right.
It's possible that that's what they intended for players to do, but to me that doesn't seem core to the loop, the fundamental loop of gameplay in Dark Souls.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing was that if that was the case, there's other ways to do that, right? I don't know if you remember, but at least the stats are very, very you upgrade them in very small amounts, and it's
Right.
very slow and it's very cumulative. So when you when you level up, you don't feel like anything changed.
Right.
Really, you're just kind of trusting that as you're investing over time, you will eventually be getting better at certain things. So as well as it's very uncustom, it's very, very expensive to go back and change other things. So other systems, like MMOs, do this pretty well in large part nowadays, which is giving you a lot of freedom to kind of restat yourself or redo your abilities. Dark Souls made that extremely, extremely punishing if you wanted to go back and reallocate your points.
Right.
So kind of every system in Dark Souls, in terms of that, like character building, more complex stuff, was not well explained. I think, despite having not played 2 and 3, I'm pretty sure, having read reviews, that idea at least became a little bit more forgiving. In terms of, it became a little bit more clear on how best you build your character, and actually make informed decisions, right? Like, if as the player, if you're basically just guessing with the stats, in large part, and that doesn't make for interactive fun. So Dark Souls is an interesting one that has really cool, elegant design in terms of its tutorial or lack thereof, but also kind of failed in some ways, at least in our view, of being able to teach you how to succeed at the game,
Right.
big long term.
Good for teaching combat, or at least like understandable, fits within the story. The more complex system, I would say it falls kind of flat in terms of introducing the player to that.
Yeah,
Again,
very
still
much.
brutal. So like, I guess if you're going to err on any side, then that's the side you'd want to err on, because you do keep the theme of it being unforgiving and brutal. But as a player, it's sort of like, why did you even put this in here? Because I don't know how to use this, and you're not going to explain it to me. So
it's one thing to make the game within its own confines very brutal and unforgiving. It's another to make the game just punishing as a human being trying to figure the game out. That's a lot less fun than kind of figuring it out and having to then work at it and problem solve.
Right.
As opposed to just like, okay, I don't know what to do now. So
I'm playing the game and it's hard is different than it's hard to play the game.
Yeah, exactly. Ooh, wow, that's really good. Dang! Write that shit down.
Yeah, where's my air horn?
Yeah, we should start putting sound effects in.
Yeah.
Actually, we shouldn't do that. That sounds annoying.
No, that sounds kind of annoying. Yeah. But Greg, I want to give you a chance to speak about one of your favorite games, one you've been playing even recently, Arkham City.
Yes. Yeah. So I've been on a big Batman kick lately. I don't really know why, but I've been. Anyway, long story. All that to say, that is one of my favorite all-time games. Seriously, like if potentially in hours that I've played, it might be up there, as well as just gun to my head, it'd be easy top 5 across all platforms and all genres. I think it's a masterpiece. And I've been playing it a lot recently, and was thinking about this topic in terms of how it does, and it is so. Again, there's a really interesting thing that happens, which that again, trying to parse a game all the way down to just like, what is the game? What are the things you do in the game? You interact with the game world. What are the challenges you overcome? And in Arkham City and the whole Arkham series, there are basically it's combat. There's the combat system, which kind of defined a combat system for a lot of games moving forward. Puzzles, kind of in the world, either using gadgets, a little bit of exploration. Some of the Riddler challenges are specific, and then the Predator maps, which are in large part kind of the stealth-based portions where there's a bunch of guys in rooms with guns that are really lethal, and you have to take them out not via combat but via gadgets and stealth and quick, swift takedowns. So that's the 3 things in the game, right? That's if you added the whole game as you play it is just those 3 things in different combinations. And the beauty of Arkham City is that they really took all 3 of those things and immediately made them fun. So the second you get into the game, you can do all three of those activities in the open world, where there's just random gangs of guys hanging out. There's squads of guys with guns sometimes patrolling rooftop areas, or certain kind of more complex areas like close to a door or kind of more of an indoor space. As well as there's all these puzzles and places that you want to be able to get to and can't get to. So from the very second you start the game, you can do all three of those activities, and each one is really fun. It's already engaging. It's already easy to do and easy to learn. And as the game progresses, you begin unlocking more either abilities, either gadgets, or give yourself more health that make these things deeper. And there's different enemies that have different tools to counteract you. But the core of it is, from the very, very beginning, extremely elegant. Like, it's hard to describe. It doesn't really have a tutorial at all. In fact, the game as a whole it just kind of starts and you're Batman. And the fact that it also is able to give you that fantasy of immediately feeling like Batman, powerful and stealthy and in control, is insane. That it's able to do that so quickly without any kind of normal tutorial mode whatsoever. So I can't speak highly enough of that one. And again, it introduces new pieces very, very slowly and kind of separately. So you don't have to learn everything all at once. But by the end, you have like 15 gadgets. By the end, sometimes I even get overwhelmed thinking about all the different ways I can clear this room, and all the different choices I have, or all the different abilities to, like, how do I want to handle this fight? Do I want to break everyone's weapons so that they're all weaponless, or do I want to try to work around the weapons with other things? Or so it's eventually, if they dropped you in at the end of the game, it would be overwhelming. But right. They really nailed that ability to make, one, the core concepts really simple and really, really approachable. And then two, they slowly integrate these new things over and over to the point where you can learn one thing at a time. And at the end, the cumulative knowledge you got is kind of bigger than what it felt like you learned.
Yeah, Arkham City it's in some ways it's kind of in between when we were talking about deeper and shallower systems, because it starts off as a pretty shallow system and then the complexity increases, but it's not like an RTS where it can feel kind of contrived. It actually seems to make sense that you're acquiring these new gadgets and new things. Can you talk a little bit about how they go about introducing new mechanics like mid-game? Because that totally sort of toes the line between trying to figure out where to go in the game and what the next thing you have to do is, and then the tutorial at the very beginning. These are like, some games they do like tutorials mid-game basically. Paper Mario is pretty notorious for this, where when you get something new, they'll like pull you aside in a really choppy way that actually fits okay with Paper Mario, I would argue. But it is very obvious. Like, okay, now you're going to learn how to use your hammer, and they're just going to take you through this little screen. Right, exactly. But I know Arkham's integration is a bit more elegant. Can you talk about that?
I could just talk about Arkham City forever. But another one of my favorite things about it, like we were kind of talking about a little bit earlier with Halo's, like I said, kind of thinly veiled, but still, at least to me, mattered reasoning for in-game happenings. In that case, it was waking up or testing a suit. In this one, like when you have to get new gadgets, or you have to find like a new side mission that opens up, the way that happens is you're just out in the world, and you will so the one I talked about last time is one of the side missions involves an assassin in the city named Deadshot, who's this master assassin who is murdering people in the city, in the prison. And you don't know why he's doing this, you don't know when he's going to do it, and you don't know how all these people are connected. So you're trying to simultaneously find Deadshot and stop him, first and foremost, but also figure out what the pattern is to his killing, so that you can hopefully beat him to the next victim and catch him there. So that's the side mission. Doesn't have anything to do with the main story too much, but the way it happens is you're just out and about in the open world, going to your next thing or training or whatever it is, and you'll hear a gunshot. In the game you'll hear this really distinct sniper rifle gunshot that pretty much no one else has, and then a side note will happen on the screen that says assassination detected, basically. And basically Bruce, as Batman, would probably have the ability to, recognize the unique weapons of his most notorious enemies, of which Deadshot is one, and it tells you where this gunshot came from. So you go there and you set up a whole forensic scene. He's gone at that point. The guy's dead. But that's the way they introduce the side mission. That's the way they start this new thing. Or another one is one I actually really like, which is just an upgrade to your mobility in the way you get around the map with your grapple gun. And this one's even a little bit more contrived, but it still works in terms of the way you get that upgrade is you go through a series of training modules where you just have to basically fly through different rings, kind of in a mini game-esque fashion. And then at the end you get it, and the Batwing drops in a new piece of gear for you. And the reason you had to do that was that it's a completely new prototype piece of gear that Lucius Fox, the tech master at Wayne, hasn't approved for field usage by you yet. And so Batman had to override the system by going through these trainings in order to unlock it. So stuff like that is just like very, very simple. And like I said, even a little bit contrived in terms of like, yeah, Batman wouldn't normally be having to run obstacle courses.
Right.
But in this case, at least it gave you a reason that it seems plausible. Or in the Deadshot one case, like, yeah, it's totally plausible that Batman would have a system that could pick up a gunshot, recognize when Deadshot is killing people,
Right.
and then go. And then once you solve the first crime, then you just have to wait until the gunshot happens again. And then next time you'll get more information, and then you figure out who the next guy might be, and then so on and so forth. So it's this really cool kind of in-world integration of the game that begins giving you more content, and avoids being lost, and also not just giving you an arrow to point to, hey, here, go do this at this place now.
Yeah, I mean, so that I love that's a fantastic example of the game giving you objectives and showing you where to go without being really in your face about it. And so
Yeah.
I think that ties really well into, let's just move into talking about objectives in games.
Totally.
And finding sort of the next thing to do, the next problem to solve, if you will. If you think of games as a series of problems, which most games fit into that category,
Yeah.
it's frustrating as a player to not really know, where do I go next and what do I do. And so you're not really teaching the player at this point how to play the game, but it's more like where to play the game,
Yeah.
I suppose. Especially in an
Yeah,
open world game like
How to keep playing the
Arkham
game.
City. Right, yeah, exactly. You want to keep the player interested. But using the big yellow arrow on a mini map can feel, for certain games it can be okay, but I think a lot of times it can allow the player to just sort of tune out and not really have to be too engaged with what's happening in the game. So I always appreciate when games find a different way to direct the player. And so I love your description of the Deadshot's rifle and how they even found an in-game explanation for why that would be such valuable information to you as Batman. Because, yeah, if I hear a rifle go off outside of my house, is it going to help me solve the crime and track down a bad guy? No. But if
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
if I was Batman, it would. You better believe it would.
Right. Yeah, he has that. Yeah, he has that ability. Yeah, God, I love that game. It's so fun. I'm just thinking about it now. I want to go play. Because I'm halfway through the Deadshot submission. I finished the main story, and I still have to finish the Deadshot one. And it's I like the finale there too. When you finally track him down, it's a fun little challenge. But anyway, yeah. So when we were thinking about this, kind of like you said, once you're in the game and trying to figure out what to do next, that really terrifying state, which I think is worse than any normal fail state, because fail states are natural and need to happen in games. The true, like, capital F fail state, I guess, would be when you don't know how to keep playing the game at all. And that's when you turn off the console and maybe don't come back to the game. And that is, like, worst case scenario. So these states of, like, being truly lost in a game, not, like we said, not being part of the game where you're trying to figure something out, or in an exploration or kind of open world game where not quite knowing what to do next isn't a bad thing. It's that point where you know you should know what to do next and you want to do something and the game isn't letting you because you can't figure it out. That is, like, worst case scenario.
Right.
And we were thinking about this. There were a few games or a few genres that seems to take to this better than others, right? Like we mentioned puzzle games already. They very much make sense that you would be in a place where you didn't quite know what to do yet, and have to figure out, where you're going or what you're doing or how to think about this puzzle in a new way. That is, again, capital G, the game. That's part of the game. Open world or adventure games, very similar in a lot of ways.
Right.
Hopefully with, like we said, we talked a little bit about Skyrim last time, right? Being kind of the ultimate example of a game that you could keep on playing almost too easily, right? To the
Right.
point where you actually wouldn't even play the main campaign because the game, capital G, was so easy to find everywhere. You would
Yeah.
always have something to do and you were never quite lost.
Right.
Or
I would say that the density of the world is such that anywhere you go, you're going to find interesting things to do, and you're
Right.
going to be advancing some subplot or some submission or doing something interesting in Skyrim. And so I think to the degree that your game is sort of sparse and there isn't much to do, and that can be a good thing. I don't say that in a way that's insulting. I mean,
Yeah,
Skyrim is a specific type of game, and games that are sparse get away with telling a much more specific story, without
yeah,
having the player be distracted by side missions and things that are not relevant to the story that you're telling. So that's fine. But if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that the player knows where to go next in order to continue on with the story that you're telling.
right.
Because
Which
it's
is
probably not part of your story that the character just kind of wanders around for a few days and doesn't know where to go.
precisely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, no one wants to play that, right? It's Call of Duty without guns. Like and that's got to be such a very difficult line to toe as developers. I think we talked about this a little bit last time, but yeah, games are like it's really easy for Mark and I to sit back and analyze and think and talk about games, and of course it's coming from a place of deep love and admiration. So we're not just critiquing to be a-holes, but games are really freaking hard to make. Like we do a podcast every week talking about all these different things that in theory have to be kept in mind at all times when you're making one of these.
Right.
So that line between trying to ensure, particularly if you're going for a game that is supposed to be more challenging or sparse, that you are giving your players that feeling and that kind of experience as a player without getting and towing that line between trying to keep it difficult and distracting versus disappointing, or confusing.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be really freaking hard to do. I don't know how I'd necessarily approach that.
Yeah.
So hats off to a lot of game devs. Like don't hear this as we just think game devs are idiots. But I think they have a very, very hard job and a very, very complex one. So
Yeah,
what about
absolutely. And I would say another type of density. It doesn't necessarily just have to do with content. Like Minecraft, I would say is a very the game is very
yeah,
dense. It's like it's hard to go anywhere in Minecraft where you feel like I'm not doing anything important. Because in
right,
Minecraft, like the important things are having fun building things and making recipes and figuring
yeah,
out what different
it's everywhere.
items you can make. Like almost anywhere you can go. I mean, you could be standing anywhere in the world and just like tunnel to the center and like find some crazy cave and
Yeah,
mine
totally.
diamond and like it's everywhere. And so that's another way that you can sort of make it as a developer where there's something interesting for you to do at all times. Um,
Yeah, and that's so that's such a good point with Minecraft, right? Because like you said, the game is just doing that. You can't get away from it. You can't get lost in Minecraft by design. Same thing with Portal, right? There's like you're always within a room where you're doing the thing. I mean, you can just stop playing basically, but that's what it would take to stop that game.
right.
As opposed to like we said, that experience we've had in Shudder, even to a small extent, not last. The horror genre, which we won't grip on too much because we spent a month talking about it. But this is another really, really, really important thing for the horror genre, which is really avoiding those, not because it's less fun, but because you are undermining your kind of core reason for playing the game, which is causing fear and tension. And so if you ever get to the point where you don't know how to keep going, then suddenly the world becomes far less scary because nothing's happening, and you've both lost the interest of the player as a game as well as the interest as a scary experience.
Yeah.
So horror is um, particularly vulnerable to these pacing issues.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the reasons for that, and it's true, I do feel like I have like a plethora to say about everything horror related.
I know
Uh,
now we have so much
so,
so much to say about it.
dang it. We will not turn into a horror game podcast.
I
Um,
know.
but when I think about the problem that horror developers are coming up against, they kind of have to make a sparse game, right? Because you can't. We've
Right,
talked in many episodes about how you can't just have the player always scared fully. Like you've got to
right,
have tension and release cycles, and what that involves is generally building up the game in a very controlled way, which means typically that if you deviate from the beaten path, the path that the developers want you to take, the pacing is going to get all messed up. Either you're going to
right,
run into like all too much content all at once if you like accidentally take a shortcut,
right.
and it's going to feel abrupt. Like, oh, there was a person jumped out from a door. Oh, there's another person. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
what? Wasn't there supposed to
Begin
be a few
expecting
minutes
people to
between
jump out
those
of
two?
doors, and then it's not scary. Yeah.
Exactly. Or you start backtracking, or you go somewhere you've already been, and nothing's
Right.
happening there.
And nothing's there anymore. Yeah.
Exactly, because you already hit
Yeah.
all the triggers that you were supposed to hit. So like
Yeah.
dynamic pacing in horror games is really difficult to get right. And so
Yeah.
you've got to make sure that the players are heading to the next thing, the next scare. There's a reason why they don't just let you wander around haunted houses until you're done. Like there's a very
Yeah.
clear way to proceed through a haunted house typically. Uh,
Usually very linear. Yeah,
yeah, and
totally. You
they,
don't see many open world horror games.
yeah, exactly.
You know.
Yeah, I think that would be almost impossible to pull off.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna let's see here. The last couple things I want to talk about would be the I want to talk about Mario and just the this would probably become actually a whole podcast at some point here talking about platformers and innovation and some of this stuff that we're going to go into. But Mark had this really cool point that I liked a lot, talking about particularly even right, Mario Odyssey just launched last
Right.
week and is blowing up the interwebs and is apparently absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure it is, and I'll probably never play it because I didn't grow up on Mario, but at the same time I can recognize its genius. But Mario is a lot of the things we've been talking about in terms of like, hey, something simple to teach versus something that's very, very difficult to learn. Mario is like the classic, like you jump. That is the entire part of that game. Versus, say, we talked about this, and this is kind of more my specialty, more so than Mark's, but is just the RTS genre as a whole being a almost absurdly complex genre to the point where it collapsed in on itself and kind of turned into MOBAs, I think, because that was so much simpler and
Mm-hmm.
to an extent, right? For the player you only have to understand one character now, for a second anyway. And so anyway, just you want to talk about that whole the difference that Mark found here was interesting. I really liked it.
Yeah, well, in a Mario game, you're right. I mean, in every Mario game, you're gonna jump, and there's not gonna be like a combo system or anything. It's not a fighting game.
Right.
You're jumping on things, and so you start off knowing that, and the jump has pretty much been the same since the beginning of the series. I mean, have they changed some of the timings? Sure, but
Right.
you get introduced to things in context in the game. So you'll show up to a level and there will be purple switches, and then you'll jump on the purple switch because you jump on everything because you're Mario, and it'll do something in the level, right? You're just like you're a
Yeah.
vandal, a jumping vandal, and
This is the one thing I have to interact with. Yeah.
so of course, yeah, you jump on it, it does something, and you learn what that switch does, and then the game typically, at least nowadays, they'll ask you to sort of do that purple switching in order to solve a puzzle or something like that in the
Right.
middle of the game, and then usually toward the end of the level. They will ask you to sort of combine that switching mechanic with something else that you know, or maybe with a boss fight or some more complexly timed maneuvering. And so you're slowly learning purple switches and how they work and what they do over the course of a level. Um, and I think this is brilliant because if you take like Mario Galaxy, Mario Odyssey, in every single level, they introduce new things. And so if I were to take all those things that they introduce you to in those two games and like condense them down into one system and present it to you, like it would be completely overwhelming, just like an RTS would be.
Right.
It would be just an immense amount of information. Like, okay, so this kind of switch does this, and this sort of block. If I stand on it for too long, it falls over. And then, like, this type of enemy, like, shoots these certain fireballs that I can, not
Right.
touch. And like, yeah, it would be way overwhelming. But the way that
Right.
the game sort of slowly introduces you to that, it can get away with having a tremendous amount of content. Um,
Yeah.
and then the cool thing that I think the Mario games start to do toward the end, is they start combining these mechanics that you know in really interesting ways because you already had a whole level or maybe a whole series of levels to learn a particular mechanic. And then they can always bring it up later. And they've got so many ideas in this sort of bin of mechanics that they've been teaching you that they can now start to put them together and constructing more complex scenarios for you to navigate as Mario. But they do this all seamlessly and without a single tutorial screen typically. They
Totally.
just expect you to figure it out because you can't. In a platformer, you can get stuck in a way that makes it force you to figure out how to use this mechanic in a very
Yep.
easy way.
Yep.
With an RTS, uh, some levels they can make it so that you really can't beat the level without a particular unit, but a lot of times you can beat a level in a way they didn't even think of.
Right.
You just like made a crap load of Marines and you swarmed the enemy before they had a chance to get anything interesting up, and then you won.
Right.
And that wasn't
Right.
at all how you were supposed to win that level. In a
Totally.
platformer, it's a lot easier to do gating. And so you
Yeah.
can say like, well, until you jump on this switch, you're not going forward, buddy. So you have to learn what the switch does.
Totally. And I think that's not to say, like, because the other thing that brought up was like it's very. I think it's tempting to think of like so RTSs, which, in case you're not familiar with them, we're talking about like StarCraft, StarCraft Two, Command and Conquer, Red Alert, Total Annihilation, Planetary Annihilation, that whole genre. tend to be, Total War definitely counts into those that genre. Um, I think it's tempting to think of those games as more complex than Mario, but I don't think it's actually true. I think Mario games are hugely complex, actually, particularly kind of the newer ones since 64, where there's this massive amount of systems that are accumulating. And actually, I apologize a little bit, Mark, because I actually kind of buried the lead. I think I had taken exactly what you'd said to heart so much. I described Arkham City in that way too, without realizing it.
Yeah,
Which is the same thing, right? It started with really simple stuff and then builds to the point where at the end it is this hugely complex system. So are these RTS games that require tons of outside sources and learning and iteration to understand and play more complex? I don't think so. I think it's just they're introduced in such a different way and are such fundamentally different games in some ways, that the complexity is very different. You put a circumstantial complexity, right, versus the complexity of actually player control.
right. Yeah, the things that you're able to do really depend on a given circumstance. Like if you learn how to use a specific item in Mario, you may never encounter that item again. Like if
Right.
it might just be in that one level, and good for you, you learned how to use it, and that's all you really needed to know was how to get through that one level. Um, Whereas in an RTS, like if you once you learn how to micro your Zerglings, then like you can use that on any map at any time.
Right.
It's not something that is ever going to not be useful to you. But
Right.
the drawback to that is it's always something you need to be thinking about. And
Yeah.
like in Mario, if there are no Koopas around, you don't have to worry about how to use green shells. Like
Sure. Yeah.
it's not an issue. And so they really can ramp the complexity and what you need to be thinking out up and down depending on the circumstances they put you in. Whereas in an RTS, it's basically constant. I mean,
Right.
you can capture any resource center, you can build anything, you can create any unit and attack anybody at any time. And if that
Right.
sounds like, wow, I have a lot of options, that's because you do. Like that's the
Yeah.
problem with RTSs, and also the
Right.
fun.
Exactly. I wanted to say that, which was in large part. I also don't want to come across as like saying Mario games are superior to RDSs. I think it's really more just a matter of preference. It's what they do well, and I do think that's probably why they're not as popular anymore. Is because we probably I don't know. They're extremely complex, and some people like them. They still have a niche market presence. They're still getting made. Just not nearly in the same ways they used to. So I think it is important to recognize that it is just different, not just entirely superior or inferior. And some people really do enjoy that level of just immense amount of freedom and being able to really really throw themselves into something. Let's see here. What do you want to talk? You want to end on just kind of that discussion about Darksiders and kind of Zelda.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we'd be remiss if we had a conversation about getting stuck and we didn't mention some of the classic instances of this happening in games. I think the most
Right.
famous is probably the Water Temple in Legend of Zelda.
Right.
Unfortunately, neither of us are super familiar with that level. Greg, actually, you stopped playing Ocarina of Time at the Water Temple,
It was
coincidentally.
that was accidental. Actually, I didn't know. I knew about the Water Temple, but it wasn't that I stopped because it was going to be too hard. It was just that I had a friend with a 64, and then we stopped hanging out, and so that was very circumstantial. And I know how sketchy this sounds, but it's
Right,
true.
Greg. Greg couldn't figure out the Water Temple.
I know. I don't want to admit it on my own podcast. That's not true. But I do have a similar-ish experience, at least, to a far lesser-known game series called Darksiders, which is another one of my favorites. Highly recommend. It is very much a Zelda-esque game, actually, like in a lot of different ways. Mine's aesthetic, where you have different dungeons, very similar to Ocarina, actually, where you have a bigger open world and you have vendors and people to interact with. But you also have basically these self-contained dungeons that have different abilities, and you have a pretty simple combat mechanic, as well as you find new items that allow you to solve puzzles, and it's very much a puzzle-solving combat kind of platformer-ish in a very, very, very similar way to Zelda. So it is very similar in some of those ways. And in fact, there is also a notorious part of this game, which is often referred to as the Water Temple of Darksiders, which is in the end of the first game, the very, very last, fortunately, I guess it's the last area. But it's called the Black Throne and is notoriously annoying to play, and a lot of people didn't finish it. It is basically there's two main problems, and one of them hopefully we'll actually expend on a little bit more in future podcasts. But one of them that I acknowledge, or was when I was thinking about, like, yeah, why did the Black Throne suck so much to play through? Is because one, it is very, very complex, which is fine in and of itself. It's a big map and it's got a lot of different places. But one thing that was really, really hard about it is the fact that it was almost entirely aesthetically identical, no matter where you were. It was all this identical black tower, black stone architecture, spikes and stuff everywhere you went, and there was almost no differentiation, despite it being this gigantic level. And I think, again, having not had any direct experience, I think the Water Temple has some similar gripes about it, which is it's actually kind of hard to tell where you are or what you're doing and keep track of all this. If you're gonna have a really complex puzzle, then you really have to make it very clear to your player what all the pieces of it are so that they can actually deal with it, as opposed to we would just get lost very often in this place. It was very hard to keep track of where it was. And then the other half of, with at least with the Black Throne, which I think is a really interesting thing, which was basically, as I was saying, one of the things with Zelda games in general is like, yeah, you find new items that allow you to do new things, and that's fine. In general, though, thing the Zelda games do really well is that they keep it very genre specific, where each one, it still feels like a Zelda game when you get that item, right? You don't get like a shotgun and then suddenly you're just like blowing people up. Darksiders, apologies, had an interesting part where the main mechanic in the Black Throne is the new item you get to help traverse it is a portal gun. Actually, literally, it's called a Void Walker. It's just a gauntlet that has orange and blue modes, and you shoot it, and it makes portals, exactly like Portal. And so you have this very complex place, and a very sudden and abrupt and unannounced introduction of a new mechanic, of a new genre, basically. And it all combined to make this area very, very difficult to play and really more frustrating than anything. So I think it's really, really interesting that, one, the fact that, like, the whole game spent this time trying to build, like, you spent the whole time in this game building up to learning certain skill sets. You're learning the combat, you're learning and, upgrading, getting better at these certain things. And then at the very end, it asks you to do something entirely different that you haven't been practicing or had to be good at all. And that was very abrupt, and I think kind of a failure of that game specifically.
Yeah.
Fortunately, the final boss fight is fantastic and really, really cool, and does make you utilize all your other skills that you had. So that's a plus. But yeah, it was an interesting experience.
Yeah, no, when you were describing that, I never played Darksiders, but when you were describing that, I was like, man, that is such a missed opportunity for them to have taken and made you competent at all these different interesting things, and then at the very final level to not require that of you. Like, as a player, especially in a game that's building toward a power fantasy like Darksiders or Legend of Zelda, where like you're becoming more powerful, you're becoming the hero of the story. You want to feel like you're getting more competent and more capable and like able to do cooler things. And so then to just like randomly say, oh, you need to do this completely unrelated thing, and then you win the game is like, wait, what?
Totally.
But I mean, thankfully for Darksiders, the final boss fight redeemed it a bit. But the fact that last level had to do with like a portal gun, which was completely separate from everything else, is just kind of strange.
Very much, especially like you said, again, like I'm big into lining up the fantasy of the game with your experience as a player, and in Darksiders, you're playing as literally the embodiment of war. You're one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, and the world has ended prematurely, and you get blamed for it. And the whole game is you trying to clear your name, basically. So it's very honor-bound, this force of whirlwind destruction fighting against the forces of heaven and hell who are left now the earth has been destroyed. And so yeah, very much the whole game is this feeling of growing power and kind of unstoppability to an extent. And then the final challenge is this like kind of, and it's crummy too. It's not even a good Portal port, It's not even a great version of a Portal idea. So that was very, very jarring. Still, go find that game. Both games, the second one too, Darksiders 2, which is really good. That is a very much the minority of those games, but very notable example. I think similarly. Oh, sorry, go on.
I don't want to harp on this too much, but I also feel like in games where the goal is to sort of be this powerful, unstoppable entity, when you throw really like difficult intellectual challenges at the player, then all of a sudden like the wind kind of gets sucked out of the sails of that particular fantasy, because like if you can't figure it out, then like it doesn't matter that you're like this super beefed up Spartan who can kill 1,000 elites because you don't know how to open this door.
Right.
It's sort of
Right.
like it
No,
totally loses all of its
totally.
momentum.
That actually happened. I was just playing through Killzone 3 with a good friend who we just play co-op games together every once in a while, and that literally happened where we had just cleared this ridiculous sequence of like drones, these superhuman warriors, rocket launchers, stealth dudes, and we got stuck because we just missed. There was the button to push to make the door open wasn't very clear.
Right.
And we ran around trying for like 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do, and we just missed one button that we had to press, and then the door opened, then we kept on playing. But like it's super frustrating as a player, particularly like you said with those power trip dynamics, which probably most action games are,
Right.
to then suddenly be reduced. It's like the like hedge that you can't jump over in most games.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, so you're supposed to believe that you are like this paragon of power and might, and you're being bested by like
Hedge.
bushes.
And I would say for that reason that games like that lend themselves more to having a really clear UI that directs you to the next thing.
Sure.
And so to the degree in which you're supposed to be like awesome and sort of know what you have to do and be on a mission and be really strong and powerful and a force to be reckoned with, you want to know as a player where I go then and what I do, because it breaks the experience of the game to just get lost and not really have a sense of direction, or to miss some stupid button like you described.
Exactly, and I think that's very key to that. Kind of to bring back to what we were talking about, the ability for a game to have been designed in a way that it's very easy to do that, and that learning curve happens naturally, or at the very beginning, even that the tutorial is able to kind of very quickly give you a sense of what you're going to be doing, and very elegantly. I think those are really important key things in games that aren't thought about as much or reviewed upon. But are extremely, extremely important. That definitely matters a lot to me as a player. And this is also tends to be, we're talking more single player here. Again, multiplayer is a little bit of a different world, but at the same time, I think the ability to have your player find your game quickly and be able to continually find it is got to be one of the most important kind of baseline things that needs to happen. Think about really popular games right now. They probably do that really well. Overwatch is notable for that. I think in a lot of ways it's very, very simple to pick up and play, and figure out how to get better at it. PUBG is a very simple idea actually at core. It's arguably the most popular game in the world right now. And then Super Mario Odyssey is absolutely blowing up. So I think that that sums up pretty well the discussion we've had so far.
Yeah, I think so. And you make a great point about approachability there at the end, that to the degree in which you can do this well as a game, your game's going to be easier to pick up, and it's going to be more approachable, and so it's going to get into the hands of more people who get it.
Right.
If people, it can take a while to get a game like an RTS because it's hard.
Totally.
So if you have thoughts, or you disagree with us, or you want to give your own feedback about tutorials in gaming, you can email me, mark@gamingmechanics.net, or Greg by emailing greg@gamingmechanics.net. And join us next week as we talk about story in Destiny. Not the storyline. We're going to be talking about the way that the game presents story. And I know that Greg is uniquely excited for this episode.
Yeah, I am a lore nerd through and through and everything, and despite having not played Destiny, I decided to throw myself into it and learn about as much of it as I could. And that game is notorious for having a ridiculously convoluted, difficult to understand story, partially due to the way it was done. And the story of the story is really interesting to me. The fact that they had this very, very deep, complex, really engaging world that they just failed entirely to show to players in the first game, and then tried to adapt a little bit and put in a new system that had certain things that worked and certain things that didn't. And then for Destiny 2, which is also very, very popular right now, or so I understand, they reworked the way the story was going to be told in the game again. For a third iteration, and so yeah, there's tons to unpack there. Narrative in games is like one of my favorite topics, And Destiny 2 is quite hot right now, so we figured we would give an overview. There won't be any spoilers, like I said. We won't be really going into the content as much as the way that they were delivering the story,
Right.
and
The
all the ways
story
that
of the
worked,
story.
and probably a lot of the ways it didn't. So,
Sounds good. Yeah, join us next time.
yep. See you guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.